The sound of gushing water filled the air as I stood ankle-deep in a puddle that shouldn't have existed, staring down at the spot where my main supply pipe had been cleanly sawed off and crudely capped with duct tape and a laminated sign reading, "Unauthorized water use, HOA enforcement." The kicker? The HOA doesn't even have jurisdiction over my land. But Karen didn't know that I'm the one who built the water system she lives off of, and now she just made the biggest mistake of her life. It all started after I got back from a quiet 3-day fishing trip. I had gone off-grid, something I do once a month to clear my head, catch some trout, and leave the noise behind. No cell service, no emails, just the river and a cooler full of sandwiches. But the moment I returned to the ranch and turned on the tap to fill Tucker's water bowl, I noticed something was off, no pressure. I tried the hose next. Nothing. The sinks were dry. That's when I walked out to the fence line and saw it. There on the very edge of my property where my main water pipe exits toward the lower pasture, the ground had been disturbed. Fresh tire tracks ran alongside boot prints, ending at a section of PVC that was no longer connected. Someone had cut my water line, not damaged, not broken, deliberately cut, then capped with a smug little sign and bright yellow HOA tape wrapped around it like it was some kind of crime scene, and taped to a wooden stake nearby, as if it were a grand announcement, was a flyer from the Willow Creek HOA. It read, in language that practically dripped with passive-aggressive cheerfulness, that all non-permitted irrigation sources attached to shared groundwater were being disconnected as per neighborhood ordinance. I stood there for a good 5 minutes just blinking at it. My ranch, which sat on 47 acres of private land, had never been part of the HOA, not once, not in any official document, lease, or county file. And the pipe they cut, that was my line from my system, from my reservoir, built and buried with my own 2 hands and a backhoe I rented back in 1993. I walked the property line just to be sure. No other damage, no intrusion further into my land. But I did notice something else. The tire marks. They belonged to a silver Lexus SUV, and the boot prints. One of them had a broken heel pattern. Karen, I'd recognize those ridiculous rhinestone-studded sandals anywhere. She wore them like she was attending Fashion Week, even when picking up dog poop. And the way the Lexus had backed up onto the grass just slightly. Only Karen would think she was entitled to drive past the neighborhood limit just because she was on the HOA board. So I did what any rational, calm, seasoned rancher would do. I took a picture of the scene, I logged the damage, and then I walked back to my barn whistling. Not because I was happy, but because I knew something Karen didn't. A long time ago, when the HOA development was being planned, the builders made a deal with me. They didn't want to pay the city for infrastructure, so I offered them a deal. I'd extend my water line to service their 30 homes, and in exchange, they'd pay a small monthly fee and maintain their own pump. The paperwork was buried deep in county records, and when the HOA changed leadership, they never renewed the lease. It expired 10 years ago, but the system, still mine. Every drop that flows to their sprinklers, toilets, and fancy koi ponds comes from beneath my land. And now they just cut me off from my own pipe, thinking they were doing me a favor. Karen must have strutted back to her HOA meeting feeling like she'd scored a victory against the outlaw rancher next door. Probably made a whole speech about keeping the neighborhood compliant and safe. Maybe even printed gold stars for the clipboard brigade. But what she really did was give me the green light. Back inside my barn, tucked behind a wall of hay bales, sits an old breaker box with 3 switches. One controls the irrigation pump, one controls the pressure valve, and the third, hidden behind a flap and labeled in pencil as backup flow gate, controls the entire HOA system. I flipped it off with one finger. Just one small flick, and 29 homes, a clubhouse, and 2 ornamental fountains went bone dry. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. By that evening, I could hear Karen yelling from 4 properties away, something about the Parkinson's pool draining mid-swim, about the Wilson twins clogging up a toilet with too much cereal. Someone called a plumber, then someone else called the county, and I sat on my porch with a beer in hand. watching sprinkler heads sputter and die across the entire cul-de-sac. The thing is, I didn't want revenge, not originally. But when someone cuts your water line without permission, tapes a smug sign on it, and tries to fine you for it when you've spent decades maintaining the very system that lets their lilies bloom in the first place, it becomes personal. Karen had turned this into a power move. She wanted to flex her control over a man who had already walked away from bureaucracy and politics, but what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, is that control is only real if the other side doesn't hold the valve. As the sun dipped below the hills and the first panicked HOA email hit inboxes across the neighborhood, I leaned back, tipped my hat, and whispered to Tucker, who had finally gotten his water from a fresh pail I pulled from the well, "Let the games begin." The look on Karen's face tomorrow morning, when she realized she couldn't so much as brush her teeth, was going to be priceless, and I hadn't even gotten started yet. By sunrise the next morning, the once manicured streets of Willow Creek were already showing signs of chaos. Karen's dream HOA neighborhood, the one she boasted about to realtors and ran like her own personal kingdom, was beginning to crumble. Sprinkler systems that usually clicked on in perfect synchronized order now remained silent. Decorative fountains stood still, their pumps wheezing as if gasping for air. Neighbors who relied on early showers before work stood at their bathroom sinks, twisting taps and frowning at dry pipes. The first wave of complaints began trickling in through the neighborhood group chat, each one more frantic than the last. Karen, of course, played it cool at first. She responded with vague optimism, telling folks it was a temporary adjustment and that a technician was already looking into it. But by mid-morning, when even her own lawn had begun to curl at the edges and her koi pond bubbled with algae, she could no longer hold the line. I, on the other hand, was sitting in the shade of my back porch, watching the whole thing unfold like a soap opera. I had my coffee in one hand and binoculars in the other, casually observing the growing panic. Karen was storming from house to house in her pressed white blouse, clipboard in hand, barking at anyone who would listen. I watched her kick a garden gnome in frustration and nearly slip on a wet patch of sidewalk that had been oversoaked the previous morning. She knocked on the Thompsons' door and began lecturing Mrs. Thompson about unauthorized water use, even though there was no water to be used. Then she pointed across the street to my land, gesturing wildly, like I was the villain from some drama series she wrote herself. Eventually, I decided to wander down toward the gate between my ranch and the neighborhood cul-de-sac, not to cause trouble, just to enjoy the view. Sure enough, Karen saw me and charged like a storm cloud on heels. Her face was red, her voice already raised before she even reached the fence. "You shut off the water, didn't you? I know it was you." I kept my voice calm and even. "Me? I've just been here minding my business, but you might want to talk to your board. Maybe they disconnected the wrong thing when they cut that pipe on my land." Her eyes widened. I could tell she hadn't thought about it that way. She had been so focused on flexing her authority that she didn't stop to consider the possibility she had messed with something she didn't understand. Still, she wasn't backing down. "You were stealing water from the HOA system. That pipe was an illegal tap." I corrected it. "You mean the pipe I installed before your HOA even existed? The one that draws water from a reservoir I built in '93? Just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing." Karen blinked. Her mouth opened then closed again. The hesitation gave her away. She didn't have an answer because she didn't actually know where the water came from. She just assumed, like most power-hungry board members, that everything revolved around her paperwork. She tried again. "Well then, why does the HOA lose water when your valve is off?" "Because you never installed your own system. You've been running off mine for years. Your HOA was supposed to renew the infrastructure lease with me. They didn't, so I let it lapse. Technically, you're all trespassing on my system. I own every drop that flows through that pipe." "You're bluffing." "Nope. County records back it up. You should check them sometime, right next to the zoning paperwork that says your authority doesn't extend an inch past that decorative hedge." She stared at me in silence, the gears in her head clearly trying to catch up to the information. I could see it, the moment where her certainty began to crack. That silence was worth every dry patch of grass she now had to deal with. By lunchtime, the HOA group chat had erupted into a full-blown civil war. Screenshots were leaking to me from a neighbor I trusted, a quiet man named Jackson who used to wave whenever I passed his driveway. Jackson wasn't a fan of Karen. He'd once been fined for planting an apple tree in his front yard, and she made him cut it down because it wasn't on the approved flora list. Now he was gleefully sharing screenshots of Karen's meltdown as she tried to wrangle the situation back into control. The board was confused, residents were angry, kids were crying because the splash pad at the clubhouse was dry, and worst of all for Karen, someone brought up the idea of getting rid of the HOA altogether. Meanwhile, a few of the smarter residents tried calling in plumbers. One even went as far as to rent a water truck to temporarily refill their home tank, but none of it solved the problem. The neighborhood was built with one main inflow source, mine. Without my pump running, they couldn't pressure their lines properly. I had built the system as a favor long ago, and now that favor had expired. Later that afternoon, a silver pickup pulled into my driveway. It was a private contractor, one of the plumbers Karen had hired. He stepped out of the truck, a man named Alejandro, and walked up politely. "Sir, I just wanted to check. Someone from the HOA told me to reconnect a main line running through this area, but based on the stake markers and the direction of the pipe, I'm guessing this is your property." "You guessed right," I said, "and that pipe is mine too. If you reconnect anything without my permission, I'll have to file trespass charges." Alejandro tipped his cap and gave me a shrug. "No worries, sir. I won't touch a thing without consent. Honestly, this isn't the first time I've run into HOA nonsense. I'll just mark it as inaccessible and bill them for the call." I liked him already. I offered him a cold soda, and he took a moment to sit on the porch and chat. Apparently, this wasn't even the worst HOA call he'd had this month. The best part came when I checked my mailbox around sunset. In it, folded neatly in a white HOA envelope, was a fine, a $10,000 violation for unauthorized irrigation access, signed, of course, by Karen herself. I took the letter inside, placed it neatly on my desk, and then began drafting a response, not to the HOA board, to every individual homeowner in Willow Creek. A formal letter, clear, professional. I explained the history of the water system. I showed them the expired lease. I offered to restore water access at a very reasonable monthly fee. The catch? Only if Karen resigned. The next morning, every single one of them would have that letter waiting on their doorstep. And for the first time since Karen started waving her clipboard around like a sheriff's badge, the residents of Willow Creek would have a real choice. The water could return, the lawns could survive, but only if the queen of the cul-de-sac gave up her crown. By the time the sun crept above the horizon the next morning, my letter had made its way to every doorstep in Willow Creek. I'd hand-delivered each one just before dawn, walking the curved sidewalks with a calmness that would have annoyed Karen if she'd seen me. Each envelope was addressed personally and included a brief but clear explanation of the situation. I didn't embellish, didn't gloat. I laid out the facts. I built the system. The lease expired. The HOA never renewed it. Karen cut my pipe without authority. And now, if they wanted their water back, she had to resign, and the residents had to sign a simple monthly agreement for access. Fair price, no trick, just business. I didn't ask for apologies or revenge. I gave them a way out. What I didn't expect was how fast everything would escalate once those letters were opened. I was halfway through feeding the chickens when the first voice pierced the quiet morning. It was loud, indignant, and rising in pitch with every syllable. Karen. She had just read my letter, and she was already outside, yelling at a neighbor, something about blackmail and illegal threats. I watched from a distance as she marched up and down the cul-de-sac, holding the letter in one hand like it was a bomb and waving her phone with the other as if she was calling the governor. At first, some of the residents seemed uncertain. I expected that. Change comes slow in a place like Willow Creek, but by noon, my phone buzzed with the first voicemail from one of them, a calm, polite man named Mr. Everett from the East Side. He thanked me for the clarity and said he and his wife were ready to sign the agreement, said he'd be happy to pay the small monthly rate as long as it meant water came back. Then a second voicemail followed from a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. She said she was tired of the HOA nonsense, tired of being fined for things like parking half an inch onto the curb, and that Karen had finally gone too far. She was ready to support my offer too. I sat in my office, sipping coffee, and played back the messages one by one until the voicemail inbox was full. Word had spread. The residents were organizing. I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen tried to stop it. That time came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting that afternoon. Karen sent out a neighborhood-wide text and a printed flyer delivered door to door, summoning everyone to the clubhouse for what she called a critical water systems update. I couldn't resist. I cleaned up, put on a button-up shirt, and strolled down to the clubhouse as a guest. I didn't speak. I just sat in the back corner, quietly observing, and what I saw was glorious. Karen stood at the front of the room, sweat glistening on her brow, mascara slightly smudged from stress or fury or both. She launched into a speech about how my water cutoff was a hostile act and accused me of trying to extort the HOA. She called me a liar, a saboteur, and even accused me of forging the documents I'd included in my letters. She claimed she had consulted legal experts and that everything was under control. Then came the best moment. One of the residents, a mild-mannered man named Rivera, who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up and cleared his throat. He said he had reviewed the lease documents I'd shared, said he also looked up the county record, and as a retired land use attorney, he confirmed every single thing I had written. He said the HOA had absolutely no water rights to the line I installed, and that Karen's unauthorized cutoff might qualify as vandalism or worse. The room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color. I saw the shift right there. The power she had clung to, week after week, rule after rule, was slipping. People weren't whispering anymore. They were speaking up. The residents began asking questions. How much money had Karen spent on those decorative HOA planters no one wanted? Why did she enforce rules selectively? Why did she never hold board elections anymore? It was like someone had opened a window and let fresh air in. Karen tried to regain control by announcing a barbecue party, said it would be held the next evening on the clubhouse lawn as a show of unity. Claimed she'd rent a water truck and refill the decorative fountains to restore community spirit. But the moment felt desperate, forced, like she was clinging to pageantry because she had no real answers. Still, I didn't stop her. I let her move forward with the plan. I had already flipped the pressure gate back on partially that morning, just enough to allow trace flow to one spigot near the clubhouse. I wanted to see what she'd do with it. That evening, I watched from my fence line as the barbecue came together. A couple of rented grills, folding chairs, and residents awkwardly sipping warm soda because there was no ice. The water truck she ordered never showed up, and the portable toilets, which hadn't been flushed in 3 days, were starting to emit a smell that even the food couldn't mask. Then came the final touch. Karen had rigged a portable misting fan to cool off the guests. It was drawing water from a hose connected to the only spigot still active, the one I had rerouted earlier with a filter that dispensed nothing but sulfur well water. When she turned it on, the fine mist that sprayed across the crowd smelled like rotten eggs. One woman screamed. Someone else knocked over a grill. A kid started crying. The misting fan sputtered and died after 30 seconds, the hose hissing as air took over. The party dissolved in a minute. Karen stood in the center of it all, soaked, red-faced, and motionless. She had no speech to give, no authority to wield. The residents were walking away, murmuring, shaking their heads. She was done, and she knew it. Back at the ranch, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew there was still a play left in her. People like Karen don't go quietly. But what she didn't realize was that the moment she cut my pipe, she started a chain reaction she couldn't control. I hadn't even touched the backup reservoir yet, and if she tried anything again, I had witnesses, legal backing, and now, most importantly, I had the neighborhood on my side. The fallout from the barbecue disaster spread faster than fire through dry brush. By morning, I saw 3 houses already posting water containers on their porches with notes saying they'd signed my agreement. A fourth house had a hand-painted sign stuck into their dead lawn that read, "We want real water, not HOA lies." Karen must have woken up to find her kingdom slipping away, one crack at a time. And true to form, when someone like her feels cornered, they don't step back. They charge forward, blind and loud, hoping the noise will drown the truth. I had barely finished my coffee when I saw her again. This time, she wasn't stomping around in heels or barking at neighbors. No, this time she wore black sweatpants, a hoodie and sunglasses too big for her face. She thought she was being sneaky, but there are only so many people in Willow Creek who own a silver Lexus SUV with vanity plates that say KHO1. I watched her from my barn window as she parked near the same fence line where she had originally cut my water pipe. She got out, crouched low, and pulled a black toolbox from her trunk. I didn't confront her right away. I wanted to know what she was up to. She had clearly abandoned all pretense of following the law. I stepped into the shadows, letting the barn slats frame my view, and sure enough, she began digging. She had gloves on and was using a small garden shovel like a kid trying to sneak candy. She uncovered the cap section she'd butchered days before and began fiddling with the connection. That's when I realized what she was doing. She was trying to reconnect the pipe, not to restore my water, but to leach off it again, to steal pressure without triggering attention from the other side. I wasn't even angry. I was impressed by the sheer stupidity of it. So I picked up my phone, dialed the sheriff's department, and explained the situation. I told them a known individual had crossed into my land, was actively tampering with private infrastructure, and that I had security footage from multiple angles. They said a deputy would be on the way shortly. Meanwhile, I flipped a switch inside the barn. It activated a small custom pressure valve I'd installed years ago for emergencies. When opened, it didn't release water. It hissed with air and released a burst of bright red dye mixed with biodegradable foam. Not dangerous, just messy. The kind of thing that would coat a person's arms, gloves, and tools in seconds. Karen screamed when the valve went off. I heard it loud and clear from the barn. She leaped back, dropped the wrench she was using, and scrambled away from the pipe, covered in what looked like strawberry mousse. I didn't move. I waited until the sheriff's vehicle rolled up 15 minutes later. 2 deputies stepped out. One of them was an older guy named Barnes, who had done a lot of work in the county for years. He recognized me immediately and tipped his hat as he approached. "Morning, Wade. Got your call. You say you've got footage of her tampering." "Yep." "Inside. Want to come see." He followed me into the barn, and I played the tape. Clear as day, there was Karen, crouching on my land, tools in hand, pipe exposed. He gave a low whistle and turned to his partner. "We've got her. Trespassing, vandalism, attempted theft of utilities. We can bring her in today." They approached Karen calmly, who was still trying to wipe the red foam off her arms using wet wipes from her purse. She tried to lie, of course, said she was out for a walk, said she was inspecting community piping as an HOA official, but they weren't buying it. Barnes told her to save it for court and read her the basics. They didn't cuff her, but they did escort her back to the car and had her follow them in her own vehicle. The sight of her covered in pink foam, walking toward her Lexus while the neighborhood stared from their windows, was better than any movie. News spread within hours. Screenshots from the security footage made their way onto the neighborhood message board. Residents were stunned. Some were angry. A few still tried to defend her, but even they couldn't explain away trespassing and tampering. One woman commented that Karen had told everyone just days earlier that I was the criminal. Another said she personally seen Karen bragging about how she handled the ranch guy, like it was some kind of law enforcement mission. Then came the part that shocked even me. A local reporter showed up. Apparently, someone in the neighborhood had tipped off the press. The reporter, a young woman named Ava, knocked on my door and politely asked if I'd be willing to give a statement. At first, I declined. I don't do interviews, but she had already spoken to a few neighbors who'd signed my agreement and said she wanted to get the full story. I agreed on one condition: no twisting of facts. I'd explain everything, but only if she let the camera show the truth. We stood by the reservoir behind my barn, as I explained the history of the water system. I showed her the documents. I even walked her to the backup valve and demonstrated how it could turn off or divert flow to different segments of the neighborhood. She asked me one question that stuck with me. Why didn't you just go to war with them sooner? Because I wasn't at war, I said. I just wanted to be left alone. But they came onto my land, cut my pipe, and called it justice. That's not how you treat a neighbor. The story aired that night. The headline read, Rancher reclaims water rights after HOA leader accused of sabotage. Karen's name was front and center. Her photo, complete with red foam on her hoodie, made the rounds on social media. The footage of her arguing with the sheriff in front of the pipe sealed her reputation, and the residents, seeing it all play out on the evening news, began lining up to sign my agreement. By sunset, I had over 20 households formally registered for water access. The flow was restored house by house, valve by valve. Sprinklers clicked back on. Toilets flushed again. The fountain sputtered back to life. But Karen's house stayed dry. I left it disconnected on purpose, not out of spite, out of principle. She had acted like she controlled everything, that she could rewrite rules, ignore facts, and crush anyone who resisted her clipboard. But the water was never hers to command. She didn't build it, she didn't understand it, and she never had the right to take it away. Now the whole town knew, and she had no place left to hide. The neighborhood meeting was scheduled for 5:00 in the evening, but by 4:30, the clubhouse parking lot was full. People stood in small clusters, murmuring under their breath, waving papers and gesturing toward Karen's house, which now looked more like an abandoned dollhouse than the HOA Queen's castle. Her grass was dry, patchy, and yellowing fast under the relentless sun. Her prized rose bushes had wilted. The white picket fence that once sparkled with perfection had streaks of dust running down the slats. Nobody had seen her all day, and nobody cared if she showed up or not. What mattered now was the vote. Inside the clubhouse, folding chairs filled every corner. The air was thick with a mix of anticipation and something close to freedom. It wasn't just about the water anymore. This was about years of frustration, pettiness, and control. Karen had been the kind of person who fined someone $50 for leaving their garbage bins out 10 minutes too long, the kind who banned sidewalk chalk because it wasn't in line with the neighborhood aesthetic. This meeting wasn't just about who controlled the water supply. It was about who controlled the community. I stayed near the back wall, hands in my pockets, observing. I wasn't part of the HOA. I had no vote, but everyone knew why they were there. The president of the HOA board, a nervous man named Conrad who never looked comfortable in any room, took the small podium at the front and tried to bring order to the noise. People quieted down, but the tension didn't ease. Conrad cleared his throat and read from a prepared statement, something about unity and proper procedures. No one cared. Finally, he got to the part that mattered. He said that due to recent events, including unauthorized actions by a sitting board member, there had been a motion to vote on removing Karen Delaney from her position permanently. A loud cheer broke out before he could finish the sentence. Then he opened the floor to discussion. A woman in the front row stood up and told everyone how Karen had once shamed her during a meeting for leaving holiday lights up too long. A man followed, explaining how Karen fined him for repainting his fence a shade too dark, even though it matched the approved color code. One by one, people shared stories, and not one person rose to defend her, not even Conrad, who seemed to be sweating through his collar. When it came time to vote, it wasn't close. Every hand went up, every single one. Karen was officially removed as president of the HOA board. Some people clapped. Others just exhaled. A few looked stunned that it had actually happened. And just like that, a decade of control ended in under 10 minutes. Then something unexpected happened. Conrad turned to me and asked if I'd be willing to speak. I hadn't planned to. I didn't want to make a speech, but the room was already looking at me, so I stepped forward. I didn't go to the podium. I just stood where I was and spoke plainly. I told them I wasn't there to gloat. I reminded them that I hadn't cut off their water out of revenge. I had simply stopped giving away something that was mine. I said that every drop that came through those pipes was from a system I built with my own hands, with my own money, and on my own land, and all I ever asked for was to be left alone. Then I offered them peace. I said I would restore full water service to every household in Willow Creek. No more disruptions, no more rationing, just water, the same way it had always been, but now with a small, fair monthly fee. I promised the rate would never increase without agreement. I also said there was one condition: no HOA rules or interference on my land, no more inspectors, no more fines. I lived by my code, and I expected the same respect I gave everyone else. The applause that followed surprised me. It wasn't loud or wild. It was steady, almost grateful, the kind of clapping people give when they feel like something real has been set right. After the meeting, neighbors came up and shook my hand. Some apologized for staying quiet so long. Others simply thanked me for standing my ground. And more than a few asked if they could bring their kids by the ranch sometime to see the chickens. By the time I got home that night, the stars were just starting to show. I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the soft glow of sprinklers lighting up across the neighborhood. One by one, they came back to life. Little arcs of water dancing under the moonlight. It was quiet, peaceful, the way things should have been all along. Karen's house, of course, remained dry, not because I was being spiteful, because she hadn't signed the agreement. I had sent it to her like everyone else, with no special message, no threats, just the same offer, fair and clear. But I never got a response. She locked herself in, pulled the curtains, and vanished from the street. Rumors swirled that she was trying to sell a house, but no buyers wanted a property with no water access and a reputation like hers. Her once perfect lawn had become a brittle wasteland, her roses had turned to sticks, and every morning at precisely 7:30, the sprinkler on my side of the fence would turn on. It was on a timer, and it sprayed just far enough to miss the edge of her driveway. Completely accidental, of course. Life in Willow Creek shifted in small ways after that. The board held real elections. Rules got simplified. People started planting flowers they actually liked instead of the approved ones. Someone even built a little free library box near the park. It didn't seem like much, but it mattered. Things felt human again. And me, I kept to my routine. Feed the animals, fix fences, tinker in the barn. The reservoir stayed full. The water flowed, and for the first time in a long time, nobody came near my gate with a clipboard or a complaint. The sign I posted there said it all. Private land, private water. Respect goes both ways. I didn't need to win. I just needed to be left alone. But if you try to cut me off from what I built and claim it as yours, you better be ready for the pressure to hit back. Not with force, not with fists, just with facts, patience, and a good old-fashioned turn of the valve. It had been 3 weeks since the vote, and Willow Creek was finally quiet in the way a neighborhood should be. Kids rode their bikes again without being chased down for helmet violations. People actually smiled as they walked their dogs instead of ducking behind hedges to avoid another HOA lecture. The water flowed, just like it used to, steady and reliable, and lawns that had turned into brittle patches of hay were now coming back to life. I didn't hear complaints anymore. I heard laughter, sprinklers, hoses washing off porches, the normal, everyday sounds of people getting on with their lives. No one was pretending it had never happened, but everyone was glad it was over. Karen still hadn't shown her face. Her house stayed closed up, blinds drawn tight, mailbox stuffed with unopened flyers. Rumor was she'd put the place up for sale quietly, but no one had seen a sign. The only proof came from a nosy neighbor who claimed she overheard Karen yelling on the phone with a real estate agent, furious that her home value had dropped. Word got around that potential buyers were asking about the water access and the news stories. One even asked if the sprinkler incident was real. Apparently someone had shown them the viral video clip of Karen screaming with red foam on her sleeves, flailing like a wet cat. The real estate agent reportedly offered to include a year's worth of bottled water with the house just to sweeten the deal. No one bit. I had moved on. My life went back to what it had always been. The chickens clucked. The barn cats lounged in sun patches. I worked the land, fixed things that needed fixing, and enjoyed the return to routine. But there was one thing I hadn't told anyone. not even the residents who'd now come to depend on my water line. It wasn't a secret meant to be held forever, just something I wasn't ready to share until I knew peace had truly settled in. And one late afternoon, as the clouds painted gold streaks across the sky, I decided it was time. Mr. Rivera, the retired attorney who had stood up in that meeting weeks ago, stopped by with a pie his wife had baked. He brought a copy of the revised HOA charter they were working on, asking if I'd mind reviewing it. I told him I wasn't interested in joining or meddling, but I'd be happy to glance it over. After we sat for a while on the porch, talking about birds, irrigation schedules, and whether apple trees would grow well in this soil, I decided to take him behind the barn. I walked him past the reservoir that everyone already knew about. The open pond was always the obvious source, and to most people, that was all there was. But I led him further, past the oak tree with the crooked limb, to a small pump house hidden by vines and thyme. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and showed him the real reason I never worried about water. The well wasn't much to look at, just a deep concrete shaft, a control panel, and a pressure tank humming steadily. But it went down 42 feet and tapped into a natural underground aquifer that had served this land since long before any developer built cul-de-sacs and called it a community. This was the real source, the one I'd built quietly after the lease lapsed, knowing full well the day might come when I'd need to remind people who truly controlled the flow. Mr. Rivera looked around, hands behind his back, nodding slowly. He understood. It wasn't about power. It was about preparation, about not letting someone with a badge or a title bully their way into something they didn't own. After a long silence, he said it was probably the most peaceful act of resistance he'd ever seen. We shared a chuckle, then walked back toward the porch with the smell of pie still lingering in the air. Later that week, someone tried to stir the pot again. An anonymous flyer appeared, taped to several mailboxes, calling my water agreement unfair and urging neighbors to demand the HOA rebuild its own independent system. It was written in capital letters, full of vague threats and claims that didn't hold up to basic logic. Most folks tossed it in the trash. A few brought it straight to me laughing. One resident even asked if I consider putting up a security camera on the neighborhood bulletin board just in case Karen was sneaking around again at night. I didn't need cameras. I had the peace of knowing no one could touch what I'd built without triggering consequences they weren't ready for. The final twist came one morning when a county official stopped by. A man in a khaki shirt with a clipboard introduced himself politely and said he was conducting a routine survey of private utility systems in the area. Said he'd been told the Willow Creek neighborhood might be operating on non-municipal infrastructure, and that someone had flagged a concern. I didn't ask who. I already knew. I offered him a tour, showed him the reservoir, the well, the piping. I handed over the old lease agreement, the letters from the county dated years back, and the new signed agreements with each resident. He looked through it all, took a few pictures, and by the end of the visit, he handed me a paper confirming everything was in compliance. No violations, no need for concern, just a signature and a handshake. As he left, he said one line that stuck with me. "It's rare we find a setup this clean. You ought to teach a class on how to do it right." By the end of the month, Karen's house went dark. Movers came one morning and loaded up her furniture. A dusty sit-in followed the moving truck out of the neighborhood, and she didn't wave goodbye to anyone. No one waved at her either. It was like the storm had finally passed. Her name was removed from all official documents. The HOA charter was rewritten, and for the first time in 10 years, the community truly belonged to the people who lived there, not the woman who tried to rule it with paper and petty fines. I replaced the old sign on my ranch gate with a new one. Not fancy, just carved wood with a clean message. Private land, private water. Mutual respect required. Some people chuckled when they saw it. Others nodded with a quiet understanding. And every morning, without fail, the sprinklers would click on across Willow Creek, not because I demanded anything, but because I kept my word. I didn't want a war. I wanted quiet. I didn't want power. I wanted peace. And in the end, all it took to stop the noise was a pipe, a plan, and the patience to let the pressure build until the truth made itself heard.